Hello, welcome to ESST1006, Human Impacts on the Environment. This lecture is on human health, disease, mortality, and the environment, how all of those things regarding humans interact with the environment, how people can be healthier, how they can be more prone to disease, and so on, with different things happening in the environment. So in this lecture, we're going to go through what is health, illness, and disease. We're going to take a look at the causes of human disease and mortality. We'll take a look at the ecology of human disease and mortality. And we'll take a look at ecosystem services and human disease, socioeconomic factors behind vulnerability to human disease. And finally, we'll take a look at changes in global and country rates of human disease and mortality, particularly as a country becomes more developed and also as global climate change kicks in. First of all, we're going to take a look at what we mean in this course by health, illness, and disease. First of all, the definition of health. This comes from the World Health Organization, and I see it distributed liberally around the internet. Health is the state of complete physical, physiological, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So basically, we're looking at health as being people feeling well, physically, psychologically, and socially. Health is very much related to the environment, but also to intrinsic aspects of the person, including age and gender. So what is healthy or normal in one context may not be healthy in another. So for instance, a level of health or fitness or freeness from disease for a 21-year-old may be different to the health, freeness from disease, and so on of a 71-year-old. Age would have a big impact on how well somebody is feeling, even though they are deemed to be pretty healthy. All right, illness now. Illness is another term that you'll see around the place. Illness is the emotional, self-perceived state of a departure from health. So somebody who is not feeling good will self-describe themselves as ill. Now, there is a distinction between illness and disease, where disease is a physical, physiological, or biological state in an individual that can be objectively measured. Now, somebody could have a disease but still not feel ill. So, for instance, they may be asymptomatic. So, for instance, somebody could have the coronavirus disease, but they are asymptomatic, they're not feeling bad, so they class themselves as not being ill, so they do not have illness. So there's an important distinction there. Illness refers to what the individual perceives their state to be, and disease is the objectively measured state of that person with some sort of physical, physiological, or biological state which can be detected. Sickness is the public or community dimension of a disease. So the disease in the context of the society. We tend to use the term sickness when we talk about how the disease is distributed in the society, whether it is prevalent, whether it is rare, and so on. So it could be a very common sickness or a rare sickness or so on. Also, whether the disease is a sickness which the society is particularly vulnerable for, usually because of some sort of physical or socio-economic characteristic of that society. All right, so different words there: health, illness, disease, and sickness. In this lecture, we're going to concentrate mainly on disease. Okay? All right, so just a little schematic there to describe the determinants of health. Here we have the core determinants of health, and that is the intrinsic factors of the individual. So that would be age, sex, and environmental factors. Above that, we would have how the individual lives. What sort of lifestyle does that individual have? And that can be very much restricted to the individual, but also dependent on the society the individual lives in. Next, we have social and community networks. How that individual interacts with the community and people around them also has a lot to do with their health. And then we have living and working conditions, all of these different things like unemployment, health and water and sanitation, healthcare facilities, whether they have housing, what sort of education they have, what sort of work environment it is, and agriculture. And these different living and working conditions may be important in different situations. For instance, you may have an individual who works in a very poor working environment, and that is going to impact on their health. Okay? You may have an individual who is unemployed, and that is going to impact on their health. And the final layer of the determinants of health are the general socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions that the individual lives in. So, is it a first world country? Is it a developing country? Is it an undeveloped country? All of those things are going to have big impacts on the living and working conditions, which is going to have a big impact on social and community networks, which is going to have a big impact on individual lifestyle factors, which is going to impact on the health of the individual. Okay? All right. So, what are the causes of human disease and mortality? So, what causes an individual to depart from a healthy state? So, what causes an individual to catch a disease and feel an illness? Okay? Well, I've got 4 different categories of diseases which are influenced by conditions in society in different ways, and are also linked towards ecosystem services and therefore the environment in different ways. Those different diseases are infectious diseases, deficiency diseases, hereditary diseases, physiological diseases. Okay? And we'll go through them one by one. First of all, the general definition of each. Infectious diseases are caused by an outside agent, such as a virus, bacteria, or some other parasite. So infectious diseases have some sort of biological agent. Deficiency diseases are caused by lack of access to essential nutrients or carbohydrates. So deficiency diseases or departure from health caused by malnutrition are deficiency diseases. And lack of specific nutrients can cause a very specific disease, as we'll see in a minute. Hereditary diseases are caused by an inherent property of the individual in their genome or in their genes that cannot be cured. The systems can be treated, but generally at the moment we do not have the ability to cure hereditary diseases. So you inherit hereditary diseases from your parents because they would have the recessive genes for this disease in their genomes, which may or may not be expressed depending on whether you're homologous for the recessive genes for the disease. I just want to note that something like Down syndrome is not a hereditary disease because even though Down syndrome is caused by an abnormality in the genome, that abnormality is caused more by environmental or physiological factors, I should say, more physiological factors, namely with people being of a particular age when they decide to have children and so on. Okay? So those people can have perfectly genetically normal children, but they can also have Down syndrome children as well. Okay? Physiological diseases, the last type of disease, are caused by malfunctions of organs and or physiological processes in the body. And they can be deficiency or hereditary or a combination of both. It's usually a combination of both. So physiological diseases are caused by a malfunction of organs and or physiological processes in the body. Quite often we call physiological diseases lifestyle diseases because they don't necessarily have to happen, and they don't necessarily, or they're not necessarily caused by any sort of deficiency in isolation. It may be an interaction between deficiency or hereditary, or maybe even infectious disease and hereditary issue. Okay, so physiological diseases are sort of like a combination of two other types of diseases. All of these different types of diseases, in one way or another, can lead to mortality. So many of these diseases don't actually cause death. They cause illness and they cause a sickness within a population, but they don't always cause death. Okay? Death occurs when a human body is pushed beyond a capacity to continuing maintaining the life processes, and this can be the result of a disease or combination of disease or some other environmental factor. Okay? So these diseases, when they're extreme enough, they can cause death, but they don't always cause death. So, different types of diseases are caused by different changes in the environment. And it's usually not immediately clear what change in a human population's environment can cause the disease. Okay, so in the course of human history, humans have had to do a lot of research, detective work, develop a lot of culture and technology, learn from past people's mistakes and so on, to determine what sort of combination of symptoms or disease is caused by what sort of factor. And it's only now that we've reached this stage where we have a lot of research under our belt that we can generally classify most diseases into some sort of category and then therefore understand the origin of that disease and how the environment has caused that disease, or whether the environment is actually causing that disease at all. So scientific research has increased the ability to understand the origins of most diseases and therefore find some way to prevent them. Okay? Diseases, however, are still part of human life. We haven't managed to find solutions for all diseases everywhere. And the COVID-19 virus is a case in point, a disease which has spread very rapidly, and it's not something which we're able to control, certainly not in the short term. Once the vaccine is developed, however, then it will be under control. All right, so let's take a look at which of these diseases tends to be most important, and it does tend to vary in different parts of the world. This graphic here is in your handouts, but I've reproduced it here because it is quite interesting. The graphic represents a hypothetical random selection of 1,000 people from around the world. It takes the proportion of that 1,000 people from different socioeconomic groups, from low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries. And it takes more people from the socioeconomic group which has the most people globally around the world. So as you can see, we've got 163 people from low-income countries, 677 people from middle-income countries, and 159 people from high-income countries. So you can immediately see that the majority of the world's population live in middle-income countries. Okay, it looks like over 60%, almost 70% of people live in middle-income countries. About 16% of people live in high-income countries, and 16% of people live in low-income countries. Okay, so each of these different graphics represents the types of disease which cause the most mortality in these different types of countries. In low-income countries, we would have the majority of people dying from lower respiratory infections. So that would be lung infections and so on. Diarrheal diseases, diseases like cholera and what's that other one? Cholera. Things which really cause you to have to go to the toilet a lot. Also, HIV/AIDS is a very important killer in low-income countries. And then down here we have heart disease. And malaria rounds off the top 5. Okay, and you can take a look at some of the other ones there. In middle-income countries, the biggest cause of death is heart disease, and then strokes, and then chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So that would be some sort of infection of the bronchial tubes and so on. And also, pulmonary, that would be the veins and so on. And then finally, lower respiratory infections. You see that was the highest cause of a death in low-income countries, but it's down at number 4 in middle-income countries. Diarrheal diseases, HIV/AIDS. Okay? And in high-income countries, we tend to have heart disease as the highest rate, stroke, pretty much the same as the top 2 in middle-income countries, tracheal bronchitis and lung cancers. So cancers here, does that come in? No, that doesn't seem to be here in the middle-income countries, and certainly not in the low-income countries. Alzheimer's and other dementias, again, not present in the other 2. Lower respiratory infections. Now we have lower respiratory infections and so on. All right, so if we look at these different types of diseases and we put them into that classification scheme that I was telling you about: infectious diseases, deficiency diseases, hereditary diseases, and physiological diseases. Okay? In the lower income countries, the lower respiratory infections, the diarrheal diseases, HIV, AIDS, those top three in the lower income countries are all infectious diseases. In the middle income countries, we have heart disease, strokes, and obstructive pulmonary diseases. So these are all physiological diseases. Something has gone wrong with the human body. Similarly, in high-income countries, heart disease, stroke, and cancers are all also physiological diseases. Something has gone wrong with the body. All right, so in low-income countries, infectious diseases tend to cause the most grief, but in middle-income countries and high-income countries, it's lifestyle diseases, it's physiological diseases, which cause the most deaths. Okay, so overall in the world, it would be heart diseases, these physiological diseases which cause the most deaths in the world. That's not to say that infections don't cause deaths in middle and high-income countries. We have lower respiratory infections. This is COVID-19 essentially, because it tends to kill people by filling up their lungs with fluid. Diarrheal infections and HIV/AIDS are all infectious diseases, and they're very important in middle-income countries. In high-income countries, things like the cancers, the dementias, they are, well, again, a mixture of physiological and hereditary diseases and certain environmental diseases. But we still have infections here, okay? But no other infectious disease, just this one here, the lower respiratory infections in the high-income countries. Okay? So if we take a look at Trinidad specifically, the reason for deaths in Trinidad, you can see that heart disease, diabetes, malignant neoplasms, not really too sure what that is, cerebrovascular diseases, that would be strokes and so on, and finally external causes. So the top four types of diseases which cause death in Trinidad are all physiological lifestyle diseases. It's only when you get down to the HIV that you get an infective disease. The cause of death here, external causes. If we go back to our middle income countries, which Trinidad is on the cusp between middle income and high income, road traffic accidents are a big cause of death in these middle income countries. So I haven't really considered those when I'm talking about diseases, because road traffic accidents are really one-off injuries. They certainly can be influenced by the environment that the person is in, and in a way you can express them as diseases, and I guess you can order your environment so people are less susceptible to those types of death. Hence the fact that high-income countries, road traffic accidents are not even on the top 10 there, even though high-income countries, loads of people drive. Okay? So things like improving the roads, improving the ability of people to follow the laws of the roads and so on, all drastically decrease road traffic accidents. But like healthcare, improving road networks and road safety is something that you've got to spend money on. Okay, so that would be the fifth most common cause of death in Trinidad, external causes, probably injury relating to traffic accidents and that sort of thing. Okay, so but the point to note is that in middle-income countries and high-income countries, lifestyle diseases generally cause the majority of deaths around the world. Okay. All right, let's take a look at a little more closely at these different types of diseases. First of all, deficiency diseases. Deficiency diseases can be solved by understanding what nutrients are lacking in a particular disease and providing them. So things like scurvy, goiter, cretinism, rickets, they were all deficiency diseases. They have been prevalent in society throughout history, okay, but they generally tend not to be part of societies today. And generally, quite often they don't actually cause death. So even in low-income countries, you're not seeing a cause of death as being a deficiency disease. Okay? There is still certainly presence of all of these deficiency diseases in low-income countries, either chronically or at specific times when there is a disruption in food and so on. And deficiency diseases are the sorts of diseases that low-income countries tend to be more vulnerable to than middle-income and high-income countries. Okay? So most of the deficiency diseases have been identified, and quite often there are fairly low-cost ways of defeating these deficiency diseases, and they have been applied even in low-income countries. So most low-income countries, for instance, would have iodine in milk and in salt, which would reduce and almost eliminate the incidence of cretinism and goiter in even low-income countries. Okay, things like scurvy also has been identified and will have been addressed even in low-income countries. Quite often now you would tend to see these diseases popping up sporadically, even in middle and high-income countries, usually as the result of poor people not having enough access to these nutrients, maybe due to lack of ability to buy the stuff. Quite often the nutrients are available in the country, but the people are simply too poor to afford those nutrients. So, for instance, somebody living in the slums of India, which is effectively a middle-income country, won't be able to get milk for calcium and iodine. Okay, and so their children may be susceptible to rickets or to goiter. Okay. All right. Oh, and here is I think this is a infographic coming from India. India is actually quite where protein deficiency can be quite a problem in India because of the vegetarianism of the majority of the population, but also the lack of money to buy proteins in other forms like milk, cheese, and beans and so on. All right, so some of the symptoms of protein deficiency are being highlighted so people can understand whether they're suffering from protein deficiency or not. So tiredness, bloating, prone to injuries and hair loss are all signs of protein deficiency in a person. All right, let's move on now to hereditary diseases. They tend to be less widespread and affect fewer people than things like deficiency diseases when they're in full swing, or infectious diseases certainly. Hereditary diseases have a genetic basis, okay, and that genetic basis must be passed on from parents. So there are molecular markers for these hereditary diseases, and with the growth in molecular biology, these markers have been identified in people and so on, and they will be able to spot whether a person has a hereditary disease or not, and therefore be able to treat the symptoms of that hereditary disease, or if it is a disease which is triggered by the environment, then try and modify the environment so that person doesn't actually develop the disease. I notice I mentioned Down syndrome here. Well, that is incorrect because Down syndrome is not a hereditary disease, as I mentioned before. Down syndrome is a genetic disease caused by a genetic abnormality, but it is not due to the genes of the parents being faulty. Okay? Theoretically, it is possible to cure a hereditary disease now with gene therapy using CRISPR or one of these molecular manipulation techniques. However, those are still a few years off. They are coming, but they're not here quite yet. So generally, most hereditary diseases are generally treated by looking at their symptoms and treating the symptoms. And it is not possible to cure a hereditary disease just yet. Okay? Developing countries often do not have the resources to manage the symptoms of hereditary diseases, which is a bit of a problem. Sometimes a hereditary disease is actually a trade-off in a particular environment, and it actually makes the person better able to survive in a particular environment. So for instance, sickle cell anemia, which is a hereditary disease, which causes the blood vessels in a person to be distorted. With the distortion of these blood vessels, they become less efficient at carrying oxygen. And so a person with sickle cell anemia quite often cannot run as fast or exert themselves as much as somebody without sickle cell anemia. So people with sickle cell anemia quite often feel tired more quickly and so on. But it's interesting to note that people with sickle cell anemia are actually immune to malaria, and sleeping sickness, which is a disease in Africa. So if you have sickle cell anemia, you can actually do without the malarial prophylactics, and you can travel around and not be affected by malaria. So this could be an human adaptation to being able to survive in parts of Africa, because sickle cell anemia is most prevalent in Africans. It could be an adaptation to be able to survive in parts of Africa where malaria and sleeping sickness is prevalent. Okay. So there's some different types of inherited diseases: Tay-Sachs syndrome, hemophilia, well, that's where blood does not clot, used to affect most of the royal families in Europe. Cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, um, which is, I think, similar to Parkinson's. Polycystic kidney disease, hemochromatosis, and sickle cell disease. I don't know what half of these diseases are. I'm sure you can look them up if you're interested. All right, let's move on now to physiological diseases. As you saw with the effects of, or the causes of mortality in different countries around the world, physiological diseases tend to be the diseases which cause the most deaths around the world, particularly in high and middle income countries. So what are physiological diseases? They're often a combination of hereditary diseases and environmental triggers, including deficiencies or, in many cases, overabundances of particular foods. Okay, so in the case of diabetes, an overabundance of sugars generally causes the diabetes, which is a physiological disease. Okay. So this disease can be present in a person or a population, but is not actually triggered. So the disease may be there, but the person may not be feeling ill at all. Okay, because it doesn't show any symptoms. But when the environmental triggers are in place, then the disease and the symptoms of the disease get triggered. Okay, so for instance, if a person can be predisposed to diabetes, he can have the genetic makeup which gives them a particular physiology which, in the presence of a lot of sugar, causes diabetes. Similarly, a person can be very vulnerable to cholesterol, blood cholesterol. They may not be able to sequester cholesterol into fats fast enough, and there's some sort of hyper efficiency in converting the fats into blood sugar. So they constantly have high levels of blood sugar, and so they're prone to diabetes, but they're also prone to things like hypertension and even plaque buildup and heart disease. Okay? So with a greater knowledge of genetic makeup of people, understanding of susceptibility of different people and populations to physiological diseases is now better known. So the culture of medicine and technology, which is developed from that culture, has allowed people to understand who is more vulnerable to these physiological diseases. Okay? And also taking a look at environmental factors like smoking, for instance, which can show that smoking is bad for everybody, no matter what their genetic makeup. Okay? So a persistent presence of a particular environmental stressor in a population can read out individuals that are genetically predisposed to suffer physiologically as a result of the stressor through the process of natural selection. So what that means basically that is if a person has some sort of hereditary controlled physiological process which is only expressed when a particular environmental situation is about. If that environmental situation is persistent in the population's environment, pretty much all of the people who are affected by that environmental stressor will have these diseases, and so they would be less likely to be able to reproduce, and they will be gradually weeded out of the population, but only if the environmental stressor is persistent and stays in the population for a very long time. Okay? So that is why in places like populations like, say, India, for instance, people tend to be more vulnerable to things like diabetes because they've not had to deal with a high sugar diet. And interestingly, people in places like Africa who have not been exposed to high levels of consumption of milk and the lactose in milk, they have not developed any sort of lactose tolerance. Whereas people in Europe and in India, because their culture and one of their main food sources for protein was milk, they have developed a tolerance to lactose. Okay? All right. So diabetes is a physiological disease triggered by an excess of carbohydrates, particularly sugar, and a lack of exercise. And that's a problem in middle and higher income countries around the world. People in lower income countries simply don't get an excess of carbohydrates, and they probably get enough exercise. Okay. So moving now on to infectious diseases. And this one is the topic of the moment with COVID-19, which is an infectious disease. Excuse me. They are caused by a biological agent or parasite colonizing the human body. The colonization may cause symptoms which make the parasite a disease for humans. So, for instance, COVID-19, when it colonizes the body, it moves, and when it gets into the lungs, it creates a symptom where the lung produces too much fluid, and basically the lungs will begin to fill up with that fluid. In many people, the immune system takes care of the virus before the lungs get too compromised, but in some people, their immune system is not able to tackle the virus quickly enough, and unfortunately their lungs fill up, and if they don't have assisted breathing and so on, they will pass away. Okay? So, colonization of humans by some sort of disease will cause symptoms which can be lethal. Interestingly enough, when you look at the ecology of these things, okay, parasites really have no interest in killing off their hosts, because once the hosts are dead, then the parasite dies as well. So a parasite will evolve, if it's around long enough, to become less and less virulent. It will become less and less symptomatic in a human population. And we've reached a point now where there are actually many biological agents and infections which colonize humans and that are asymptomatic, or actually may even be beneficial, and therefore are not classed as a disease. So our body plays host to many different types of bacteria and viruses which do not do us any harm at all. The parasites get their life cycle, and we get to live a quiet life, so nobody bothers each other. Okay? When a parasite is new to the human host, however, it quite often does have negative consequences for the host. Okay? Causing negative symptoms and often mortality. And this will drive humans to use culture and technology to eradicate that disease, which is not in the best interest of the parasite, but because it can't control itself, then humans will move to eradicate that disease. So things like polio, tuberculosis, because they were the symptoms which they showed when they infected people were too severe and quite often lethal, then humans moved to eliminate those parasites. And so things like polio and tuberculosis are very, very, very restricted now around the world. Tuberculosis, I think, is almost, and smallpox, no, it's smallpox, is almost completely eliminated. And things like measles and chickenpox were also very close to being eliminated before our good friends, the anti-vaxxers, got into the game. Okay. New infectious diseases do arise, quite often where humans intrude into a new environment where the parasite already exists. Quite often it already exists in a host where it is the host is adapted to it, so the host does not get any bad effects from that parasite, or a new parasite evolves from a previously benign one. So these new parasites can reach into the human population, and they're actually called a zoonosis. And unfortunately, these zoonoses, when they do reach into the human population, they can be often quite severe because the parasite has not adapted to the human host yet and can cause very severe symptoms and death. Okay? The COVID-19 virus, I think I'll talk about that in a little bit. All right. Actually, no, I think I'll talk about that now. So the COVID-19 virus is a new virus, one such of these new viruses. It entered the human population when people in a market in China harvested bats from the environment, probably from a place which hadn't previously been harvested. And the bats in that population contained this virus. Now, these bats probably lived quite happily with this virus. It didn't affect them, maybe gave them a little bit of a cold or a runny nose or something like that, but nothing too serious. But when people ate those bats after buying them at the market, they caught the disease, and the disease made the jump into humans. And because the mechanism of the disease was the means of transmission of the disease in bats, it may have been airborne, then it was airborne in humans too, and therefore it became very infectious. And because it wasn't adapted to the human host, it was quite virulent. So people began dying from COVID-19. A similar story can be told for HIV/AIDS and also for Ebola as well. And there are another types of viruses around the world which are like that. The Hendra virus in Queensland, for instance. So it's not only developing countries which can encounter infectious diseases, developed countries like Australia and also Germany, I think, with their Marburg virus, which are caught from monkeys brought in from Africa, can also be affected. Okay. All right, I want to make the link now between ecosystem services and diseases. And to do that, I just want to recap on this graphic, which I've given you before. We're taking a look here at human health, okay? And as you can see, human health tends to be influenced mainly by the provisioning services and the regulating services, okay? So let's take a look and see why that is. So health of humans tends to be mainly served by provisioning services and regulating services. Well, it's easy enough to see why deficiency diseases are linked to provisioning services. Some sort of failure in food production or food distribution, and the humans are living then in an ecosystem which doesn't provide them all the nutrients they need, and they will suffer some sort of deficiency diseases, whether it's hunger or whether it's one of the many nutrient deficiency diseases. Also, humans can suffer from a failure of food distributions, with humans increasingly living in urban ecosystems which doesn't provide the nutrients directly. Okay, say for instance in urban areas or in ships. Back in the 17 and 1800s, think scurvy, not all the nutrients were brought in for humans to eat, and people suffered from deficiency diseases. Even today, people are suffering from deficiency diseases, are more likely to be living in urban environments, and the reason for the deficiency disease is a failure in food distribution rather than in food production. In agricultural situations, deficiency diseases can arise when farmers in low-income countries convert to cash crops and only grow a limited number of food crops then to eat. That limited number of food crops means that some nutrients may be missed, and we may get deficiency diseases creeping into the population. In low developing country, prisoners may be fed a constant diet, so something like white rice continuously, or maybe just beans continuously, and certain nutrients may be missing out from their diet, leading to some deficiency diseases. Okay? All right, I just want to take a look now at some of these different diseases, changes in ecosystems. I think this is probably, I'm going to leave this for the moment and move on now to hereditary diseases. It's very difficult to assign some sort of ecosystem service that allows people to overcome or live with hereditary diseases. However, if we look at developed countries where hereditary diseases tend to be less of a problem than in low-income countries, the reason why they're less of a problem is because treatment for the diseases are ongoing, and the medicines required to treat the symptoms of these diseases are always required but always available. In low-income country, they may not be available. So people with these diseases need medicines, which is a good distribution networks to get these medicines. So equitable environment to transport these goods. So provisioning services and equitable environments means regulating services. So again, regulating services so that disasters don't break transport networks regularly and so on, so the medicines will get through, and also provisioning services. Even if it's the medicines are produced in a lab, you need good lights, good water to run a lab. If you don't have good supply of electricity and water, then labs cannot produce these medicines. So these must be provided to get the medicines. So theoretically, people with hereditary diseases are much more vulnerable to breakdown in provisioning services and regulating services. So developing countries where provisioning services for medicine and regulating services that protect transport networks are much more vulnerable to disruption, and people with hereditary diseases are more likely to die. Okay? Follow my reasoning there? All right, physiological diseases. People are less likely to die from physiological diseases in low-income countries, mainly because a lot of these physiological diseases are created in an environment of excess rather than an environment of deficiency. So a lot of the people who have these types of diseases and die from them in the middle income countries mainly die because of the things like diabetes. Treatment for things like diabetes require insulin, which is produced during bacteria in a lab setting, and the lab production requires those provisioning services which I noted before. Okay? So in middle income countries where the death from these physiological diseases is highest, it's usually highest because the treatments are less able to be put in place to treat these diseases of excess. Okay? Infectious diseases now. Now, infectious diseases, as I said before, most often enter human populations as zoonoses or disease caught from other animals. HIV/AIDS was caught from monkeys killed and eaten by hunters in Africa. COVID-19 likely came from bats or pangolins in an animal market in Wuhan in China. And something like Hendra virus was passed to the human population from fruit bats, then transferred to horses, which would then transfer it to humans. So Hendra virus basically killed people in the equine industry, and mainly people like vets who came to treat diseases in particular horses. Okay? Where animals and humans interact, there is a possibility of zoonoses to occur. So in cultural situations where humans and animals interact more, then you would tend to get more transmission of these zoonoses. Okay? People tend to interact with animals more, and also more novel animals, when they expand their activities into previously unexploited environments. So, for instance, if humans go into the forest to harvest bats and then bring them back, then they go to a new area, they may potentially be harvesting animals which have an infectious disease. Okay? Infectious diseases and zoonoses may also result from diseases which mutate within the human environment already. So previously infectious disease, which does not give any symptoms, may turn into a killer disease by some sort of mutation in the virus. Okay, and these viruses will mutate very quickly because they have a very short life cycle and they are mutating all the time. Okay, in that case, something which may be in pigs or cattle or something like that, which humans are in close contact with, may mutate and cause a more virulent disease to arise. And if the humans are tending to these domesticated animals, they will catch that more virulent disease, and then the disease will pass into the general human population. The most frightening diseases are those which are transmitted by airborne water particles, okay? Because they are very difficult to control, okay? I'm afraid somebody's using a leaf blower out there, so our sound quality is likely to deteriorate over the next few minutes, okay? Regulation services by ecosystems can help keep a distance between animals and humans. And these ecosystem services will break down when humans begin to occupy all ecosystems and areas, or when humans domesticate animals. Okay? All right, so humans are more vulnerable to disease in developing or undeveloped countries. Why? Mainly because technology and culture has been developed to create and produce medicines which treat the diseases directly or treat the symptoms of those diseases. Money is required to use this technology and produce and deliver these medicines. And in lower income countries, governments do not have that money to produce these medicines. Transport or distribution of these medicines is also a problem in developing countries as well. And developed country companies are the ones which usually have the money to develop these things, and they may charge a too high a price to recoup the costs of this development, which the developing countries cannot afford. So for these reasons, this technology may not be as available to developing countries. And so developing countries and low-income countries will be more vulnerable to human disease than the high-income countries. Okay? Ecosystem services or provisioning and ecosystem regulation services may actually be degraded by human activities in developing countries, and no remedial action is put in place because it cannot be afforded, and it also may not be immediately apparent that these services have been degraded, so people don't take them on. Okay? Infectious diseases are some of the diseases which are least responsive to increases in GDP. In other words, an infectious disease is as much of a danger in a developed country as it is in a developing country. The difference between a developed country and a developing country is that it may be able to combat the disease more effectively by having the communication and the resources to be able to isolate people, for instance. And also, it will be able to recover faster compared to developing countries from a disease epidemic. Okay? Generally, airborne, highly transmissible diseases still do not have technological or cultural solutions that can be installed quickly. So until we develop a vaccine which can work across a broad spectrum of viruses, things like COVID are still likely to happen in the world. Okay? So, generally around the world, as GDP goes up in a country, then disease goes down, and therefore mortality goes down. So technology, as I said in the previous slide, is used to minimize the impacts of disease on human population. Facilities such as hospitals with highly trained staff allow treatment of many of the symptoms of these diseases. And in developed countries, medicines are relatively readily available, produced in the country, and also stockpiled. In developed countries, human and animal interactions are regulated much more tightly so that zoonoses are less likely to occur. So the jump between animals and humans is less likely to occur because hygiene regulations in developed countries are much more strictly enforced, so that you'd see much less jumping of zoonoses. Global climate change in the future is going to alter a country's vulnerability to disease. Okay, so with global climate change, there will be disruption in things like ecosystem services, which is going to alter a country's vulnerability to disease. And if we can take a look at this slide, we can take a look at temperature-related illness and death, extreme weather-related health effects, so things like flooding and so on, air pollution-related effects due to climate change, water and foodborne diseases may change during climate change, vector-borne diseases. The vectors will change in their distribution with climate change. Extreme weather effects are going to change with climate change, and temperatures will tend to increase around the world. Foodborne and water and foodborne diseases with changes in things like rainfall and humidity. We're going to get changes in distributions of food and waterborne diseases. Effects of food and water shortages are going to increase, say, deficiency diseases more. So we're going to get, as rainfall patterns change, you're going to get more food and water shortages. Mental, nutritional, and infectious and other health effects are going to occur more widely due to all of these different health effects. So global climate change through changes in agroecosystems, hydrology, changes in transmission dynamics with changes in vectors, changes in temperature are going to put more stress on temperatures and how they change food going off and so on, and therefore change contamination pathways, are all going to be changed with global climate change. Demographic and socioeconomic disruption as agroecosystems change and floods change and so on. It's going to cause disruption. People are going to be on the move, and while they're on the move, they're going to be more vulnerable to different diseases. All right, so there you go, a little snapshot there on how different diseases are related to the environment and how different diseases will change with time and why they are different in different income level countries around the world. Okay, thank you very much for sitting through that. Hope you didn't do it all in one session. Goodbye.